Okay, good morning, Mark, and all of the other forum members attending this presentation. To introduce myself, I'm Bashan Govender. I'm based in the National Department of Water and Sanitation in Pretoria. And the purpose of this presentation today then is going to look at the Witwatersrand Acid Mine Drainage project. It's a project that's been in the making now for roughly the past odd 11 years, having started in about 2010, recognizing the risks of acid mine drainage impacts to the Vaal River system. And over the past 11 odd years, there's been a string of events that has taken place. And the purpose of this presentation is then to share with you and give you an overview of what has taken place and what's going to be the way forward. I just want to start with some points, what I regard as a disclaimer. What I'm attempting to present here is basically a factual representation as what has transpired with regards to the implementation of the project from about 2010 onwards. I've tried my level best to give you very unbiased and balanced views. And in doing so, I think it's imperative that everybody takes note that some of the opinions that I express here are actually my own opinions. These are based on my observations, having worked in the AMD and the mine water management space now for close on 12 years. And some of these views are therefore not necessarily that of GWS. I don't believe that my opinions actually contradict the department, but I'm just making it known that some views are my personal views based on experiences that I have actually observed. Just a caution, I attended a conference in December of last year, and a week later, having attended another conference, I found that some of my content was reflected as screen grabs in presentations done going by other parties. If you are going to be using a screen grab, I'm requesting that it not be taken as another individual's content. And you need to use that as caution because some of the facts that I make here have to be quoted within the contextualization of the content of this presentation. The final point that I want to make is just with regards to the definition of AMD or acid mine drainage as we've abbreviated. I'm going to be drifting between the terms AMD or mining impacted water for all intents and purposes. I just want to refer to water that has come into effect with a mine and the mine void, for example, and has actually become contaminated in nature. So there's no hard and fast definition of what AMD is versus mining impacted water. For the sake of this presentation, I'll use whatever is convenient for that moment. I know there is a technical definition of what AMD is. Some authors define it as water having a pH of less than 6.5. And if we had to consider this for the water that's currently coming out of the East Rand mining basin, that is not AMD in the true sense. So just let's avoid getting into any technical debate as to what actually defines AMD. Moving on, where this presentation actually stems from, it came largely through the request of the Vaal River Forums. I subsequently was contacted by Mark or Rand Water, and I think Mrs. Liefrant of the Federation for a Sustainable Environment did also have an interest. So I was jointly approached by the both of them with a request that we make a joint presentation to all the relevant forums encompassing the Vaal Dam and the Vaal Barrage forums. And that is why we are here today. And I'm hoping to take you through this, the past 10 years and give you an overview of what's actually happened. I will also give you the background, where we come from, the current status, and that's with regards to the Witwatersrand Acid Mine Drainage short-term solution that has been implemented in recent years and is currently operational. So that will give you then the indication as to where the project is currently. Then looking at the future interventions moving forward, I want to touch base on the acid mine drainage long-term solution. I understand that there's considerable interest in how the short-term solution will be migrated into the long-term solution and what's the thinking and the way forward with regards. I'll also very briefly touch on mine water management in other areas. The function of myself and colleagues has actually come from dealing with acid mine drainage in the Gauteng goldfields. But we also recognize that mine water risks can manifest in other areas that are being intensively mined, such as the coalfields of Mpumalanga. And I'll just refer you to a couple of the key policy and legislative interventions that are underway to broadly address the mine water impacts on a national level. And then lastly, we will take some questions and go into comments and discussion session. I have received some questions upfront from some of the forum members, and I suspect that in the presentation, I'll actually cover the content. Just with regards to the presentation, I will ask Mark to stop me if there is any clarity sought on a specific slide. But I think the process will be that we will take the actual questions during the discussion session, the Q&A session. In going through this presentation, I indicated I'm going to be unbiased and try to give a balanced view. So I will want to start off by touching on some of the aspects with regards to the significant South African mining sector. We'll look at mining impacts on the environment. Looking at the impacts, we also want to look at some of the positive benefits that we derive from the mining industry. We'll move to the Witwatersrand Acid Mine Drainage project in the context of the Vaal River system and why the project itself warrants concern. And then looking broadly at the national mine water mitigation and mine closure objectives, we want to look at what are the lessons for the future. What have we learned from the current process? And how do we try to shape relevance and resilience in future mitigation interventions? I think it's important that I actually acknowledge some of the core people that we've been working with over the past couple of years. There's some misconceptions out there in the sector external to the department, or external to government, about who's actually dealing with the mine water management issues. So just in terms of the actual project team, at the top, we've got Londolani Mochekwa, who's an environmentalist, and she provides sort of a very high-level oversight of the team. I've got Desmond Mochine, who's a scientist dealing with geohydro competencies. And then I've got 4 engineers, all of them chemical engineers, Sam Kalisa Tengwa, Ayanda Mtetwa, there's Divan van Niekerk, and Kevin Apane. Kevin is the latest addition. He's undergone the training, adopted into the structure now. So these engineers are sort of neck deep in the actual plants and the day-to-day operational issues, managing the plants, etc., and providing reporting to the department structures. We've got Candace Enoch, is also an environmentalist, and she comes with some infrastructure management background, having been involved with the national water resources projects. And then the 2 of the youngest crew members are Zimbini Mazula and Siamo Oliphant. These individuals are currently in the training program. They are scientists by qualification. They've been with us now for, I think it's going to be going 3 odd years, and they're making good inroads and are able to work independently. And I actually see them together with other colleagues as the future of mine water management. And then it's myself. I think I'm the oldest, not necessarily by age, but probably by experience. And my task is obviously to lead and provide an enabling environment for the colleagues that I've just mentioned. Also within the DWS, at the Integrated Water Resources Planning Directorate, or Chief Directorate for that matter, we have a gentleman by the name of Jurgen van Wyk. I don't believe he needs any introduction. His name is acutely associated with the department's feasibility study that was conducted to identify a long-term solution for acid mine drainage management in the Wits goldfields. Jorgo was actually the study manager for that process, and we have and continue to work closely with him to understand the longer-term implications of acid mine drainage on the Vaal River system. On our implementing agent side, which is the TCTA, that's an entity of the department, we've got Sophia Tlale, and Sophia has been very instrumental in facilitating linkages with other governments, stakeholders, as well as setting up the relevant communications with NGOs. She comes with considerable experience on environmental issues and stakeholder engagement because she did work in the Lesotho Highlands project phase 1. And we certainly rely a lot on Sophia in terms of providing communication. And I'm sure she as well doesn't need any introduction to the forum members. And then from the project management side, with regards to actual physical project implementation, we have Craig Hassan-Jager also with the TCTA. Lastly, in terms of the stakeholders, I think it's critical that the stakeholders actually gain recognition and are noted for their contribution. I hold the view that stakeholders actually hold government accountable, and that's exactly what it's all about. We have to account To external stakeholders in this regard, I would like to recognize the FSC's Mariette Lieferink, as well as the other NGOs. It's not going to be possible for me to do them. And then thanks to Mark de Fontaine from Randwater for hosting, having been in engagement with me in recent weeks to try and set up and make sure we have a successful presentation here and something that we can share information openly, transparently, and ensure robust dialogue moving forward. To give you then an indication of the overview of mining in the country, we have something like 2,700 mines that's scattered across the South African landscape. That activity is typically confined to the Northern Cape region, and it moves in a easterly direction up to the northeastern limb of the country that's bordering the Limpopo and the Mpumalanga catchments. And obviously close on to us, we've got active mines in and around the Johannesburg area. With the 2,700 odd mines that are currently operational, or some under care and maintenance, scattered across the country, there's also about 6,000 odd derelict mines. And some of these mines are actually what we classify as ownerless mines, meaning in terms of the business processes, it's not possible to trace who operated or who owned these mines previously. And worryingly, with those derelict mines, we also have about 6,000 mine residue areas. And mine residue areas basically means impacted mining footprint. It can be anything from mining contaminated land through to your TSFs, your tailings facilities, and your mine waste rock dumps that we see, very typical of the gold mines in and around the Johannesburg area. Okay, for the purpose of this presentation, you'll note from the slide I've highlighted where the Witwatersrand goldfield sits in. That's just south of Johannesburg, indicated on the map by that little pink box. And that's going to be the purpose of this presentation, where we're going to talk about the acid mine drainage impacts and the mitigation interventions that have been implemented for that specific area. Okay, moving forward, I did indicate I'm going to give a bit of a balanced view, and the purpose of this presentation is not to purely talk about the impacts associated with mining. I think it's important that we also recognize how mining has contributed to the social and economic development imperatives of the country. I won't go through all of the trivia on this slide, but it's an established fact that South Africa has the deepest gold mines in the world. And from about 1850, when gold mining started in and around the Johannesburg area up until current, South Africa has been responsible for producing more than half of the world's gold supply. A Rand refinery in Germiston was once the world's largest gold refinery. In terms of our platinum and metals, we would want to recognize the fact that we have the largest platinum mines in the world. These are located out in Rustenburg, and I think it's common knowledge that much of our platinum is exported to other parts of the world for manufacturing purposes. It's a known fact that we have about $1 trillion worth of reserves lying, so that in itself makes us a very attractive destination for investment, as offering potential mines that can supply the world commodities in terms of mining requirements. And also we are a notable player with regards to our coal reserves in the world. And we trade and rely heavily on coal exports to the Northern Hemisphere, as a matter of fact. In terms of the outputs that we've derived from mining, the important part is highlighted in that yellow box. The reality is that Gauteng would not have been where it is today if it was not for the discovery of gold. As a matter of fact, the mass influx of people and the rapid urbanization and industrialization and business development and the social influx into Gauteng associated with the gold mines actually necessitated the Lesotho Highlands and the Tugela Vaal water transfer schemes to be built just to allow adequate water supply to Gauteng. Without those systems, the natural drainage and the river systems of Gauteng would not have been able to sustain the water requirements. Moving on, to recognize also the mining or the output of mining in our country, apart from mining commodities for retail and manufacturing, power generation, etc., we also have to recognize the social and labor plans associated with mines. And there are many communities that have derived facilities ranging from community subsistence crop farming, basic schools, basic education, adult basic education and training, primary healthcare services, all because of mines. I don't think government, whether you consider the pre-democratic government or the post-democratic government, I don't believe government on its own, without the contribution of the mining sector, would have been able to adequately provide these services to our citizens. Now, moving on to just reflecting on the slide, I think it's important that we also pay attention to the fact, the importance of mining with regards to power generation. And this slide pretty much sums up the relevance of coal-fired power generation to ensure power production moving into the future. I think over the next 10 to 15 years, Eskom will be required to double its generation capacity, and that's going to be to coal-fired power generation. And simply what I'm saying with this slide is that with that coal-fired power generation and increased coal mining, we have to be able now to recognize that potential acid mine drainage or mining impacted water impacts, how that is going to impact on water security. And you have to bear in mind that the impacts associated with AMD, when it cuts across the water security issues, it affects a host of other water users and sectors. So we have to recognize this risk upfront now and build the necessary mitigations and interventions going forward. Also, with the water security, the risks of climate change certainly cannot be ignored. And we will have to also pay attention to the fact that water security is important for ensuring we have food security for both the domestic market as well as the export market. Now, I've touched on the benefits derived from mining in terms of contribution to GDP, stimulating the international markets, the social of the mines, foreign investment contribution, etc. But it brings us into a vicious conundrum, because with the positive benefit and the spin-offs, we also have the social upsets. And I think it's very common that we see unrest situations, industrial action in the mining sector, etc. There's a host of social elements that come with it, like TB and HIV. And then the one that we would be concerned about is the environmental impacts in terms of noise, water pollution, ecosystem degradation, etc. And I think these impacts, the impacts on the environment, actually become very pertinent and of concern when we have to consider the post-mining situation if we don't have adequate risk mitigation built in whilst mines are active. Just moving in a little bit more to hone in some focus on the goldfields of the Witwatersrand that surrounds the Johannesburg area. I did indicate that we've got the largest and deepest gold mines which triggered or stimulated the 1850s gold rush. And in and around Johannesburg, we have large mine voids and a host of mine waste facilities. It's quite obvious when you drive on the N1, the amount of mine waste that straddles the Johannesburg area. And we have unclosed mines, all of which are a risk to the water resources. We would also want to take into account that the pre-1994 government, the legislation that governed mine water management was either absent or ineffective or very poorly implemented. And the result then was that the impacts were externalized to broader society. And obviously under old legislation and in the absence of legislation, the mindset was that you could mine at the expense. There was really no forward planning in how to deal with the risks associated with mining. And government post-1994 has unfortunately inherited 140 years of mining legacy impacts. And with that comes risks to the environment, as well as potential water security risks for Gauteng, as well as the entire South Africa or the other mining areas of South Africa. I'm talking to the issue of water security, and this slide, in the background, I've got the Katsi Dam in the Mountain Kingdom of Lesotho. And around that, the water security issues with mining are shown in the little photos arranged in a section. And we've got drainages that are copper rich, for example, or metal rich. We've got real AMD shown by the picture in the 3 o'clock position, where you've got pools of reddish brown water. We've got a string of abandoned pits located at various points of the country. We've got mine closure, which is very poorly implemented. We've got undermining of water courses that causes subsidence and then loss of surface water into groundwater resources, making that resource being unavailable. And we've got runoff from mining areas, which impacts water ecosystems. So all of these come together and has a big risk for water security. And it's not something that can be swept under the, it's a reality that has to be dealt with. And I think it's not just the responsibility of government, it's also the responsibility of the mining sector to ensure that they comply with the environmental obligations. With regards to the water security, and here I'm specifically referring to the Vaal River system, there are 4 interventions that's currently being led by the department. The first is the water conservation and the water demand management, which is a volume-based initiative. The second, also being a volume-based initiative, which is the reliance on mega augmentation. That's civil structures, like, for example, Switzerland's phase 2, and the proposed Yana Militane transfer scheme on the Tugela system to bring additional water into Gauteng. Then in the third volume-based initiative is the requirement to curtail the illegal water users. I mean, there's a fair amount of water that's abstracted illegally through unauthorized water uses for agribusinesses and other commercial activity, which are not registered. And if it's not registered, it means then that the department does not derive revenue from those water uses. The last one, and the one that we are specifically concerned on, is an initiative which involves water recycling or reuse of what we colloquially call grey water. And in this regard, we specifically referring to acid mine drainage or impacted mine water, as well as sewage reclamation. And this, aside from a volume-based contribution, there's also a quality-based implication with this intervention. Moving forward, just to touch on the relevance, I talked about the true water transfer schemes coming in from Lesotho. That's LH phase 2. Currently under development. And then on the KZN side, we've got coming over the Drakensberg formation, we've got the Tugela Vaal transfer system. And these interventions are quite critical, as I mentioned previously, to ensure that Gauteng, the Vaal, has adequate water to supply Gauteng and surrounding provinces. Now, the question that has been asked, and probably for the benefit of those who are not too familiar with the project itself, just to give you an overview of the 3 mining basins when we talk about the Witwatersrand AMD project. Starting out on the eastern outskirts of Johannesburg, and this encompasses the towns of Springs, Nigel, Benoni, and Brakpan. We've got the Eastern Basin mine void, which is actually the largest mine void of these 3 mining areas. And with acid mine drainage forming in the Eastern Basin, there's potential for that for that AMD to then decant or make its way into the Blesbok and Sprekelsbos river systems, and then make its way into the Vaal Barrage. In the more central, in the south central region of Johannesburg, below the city of, south of the city of Johannesburg, in the Germiston area, we've got the Central Rand Basin. And I think this is the oldest mining basin out of the 3. And the risks associated with that basin filling up and decanting and flowing into groundwater or surface water systems is that it will have an impact on the Klip River system, which will then also report to the Vaal Barrage. Lastly, out in the western side, the western outskirts of Johannesburg, we've got the Krugersdorp Randfontein area. And this is the smallest basin, smallest but actually the worst quality water, what we call the Western or West Rand Basin. This system is actually divorced from the Vaal River system because any impact associated with the Western Basin actually makes its way into the Crocodile River system, which is the Hartbeespoort catchment and then flows into the Limpopo. So as much as this presentation will talk about efforts or activities undertaken in the Western Basin, I need you to bear in mind that the Western Basin AMD does not have an impact on the Vaal River system. Now, to expand on AMD flowing into the surface resources of the Klip and Blesbok, we would need to appreciate that this is highly saline water, metal-rich water. When it flows into the barrage, can potentially compromise the downstream users. It may take the TDS above the ideal fitness for purpose levels and render that water unusable to the downstream environment. And if this happens, we then have to release clean water from the Vaal Dam. Remember, I indicated that the Vaal Dam itself, its volume on its own is insufficient, and water has to be brought in from the Tugela Vaal as well as LHW Phase 2. Such is the water requirement out of the Vaal Dam that the Phase 2 is actually currently being developed. And I know that the date there shows that it's 2025. Recently, I believe that that may be now extended up until 2027. So there's going to be a delay in bringing in more clean water to augment the supply in the Vaal Dam. And we've also got on the Tugela Vaal transfer system, 2 more dams proposed, which is called the Yana and the Militane dams, to also bring in additional water. But these are merely concept at this point, and a significant amount of work will have to be done, as well as funding obtained to commence with this initiative. So in short, what we're saying is that the Vaal Dam has inadequate capacity. It has to be augmented from external sources through transfer schemes to make sure that the Vaal will have adequate water for Gauteng and surrounds. And if we had to release that clean water from the Vaal Dam, just to dilute the TDS associated with the AMD coming out of the central and eastern basins, the purpose of the dam is lost, and it's just unsustainable. It's poor water management, water resources management practice if we have to dilute clean water or release clean water to dilute mining-related pollution. So this is, in short, a simple summary of the impact associated with acid mine drainage if no mitigation interventions are adopted. Moving forward, this is a picture that I always like to show because it's a stark reminder of how AMD started and how it became a concern, how it ruffled feathers. And this picture dates back to about 2010 when acid mine drainage started flowing uncontrolled onto surface. And this is taken out at the 18 winds ventilation shaft in the West Rand, just outside Krugersdorp. The water itself, if you look at it, it looks fairly clear and clean and nice, but the reality is it's heavily impacted. It's virtually unusable. I think the pH of this water at that time was probably in the order of about 2.8. Sulfates were close to 5,000 milligrams per liter, and iron was in the order of about 800 milligrams per liter. So this is just a rough indication of how poor quality that water is, and it basically sterilized the downstream receiving environment. And the next picture shows that clearly. You can see after migrating probably about 2 kilometers downstream, through aeration, the iron is oxidizing and settling on the stream bed, rendering this river system devoid of all life. We still have a very high pH water flowing in, which does not allow for any fish life or aquatic life to thrive in. So it's a risk definitely to the natural ecosystem. But aside from the natural ecosystem, there's risks then for groundwater and for the downstream users, because the water is so heavily polluted that it's virtually unusable. Now, having recognized this process, there was an interministerial committee that was established in 2010, and that interministerial committee comprised of 5 or 6 key departments, government departments, notably water and sanitation, or water affairs as it was called then. It also had the Department of Environmental Affairs, which is now the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, the Department of Mineral Resources, the Department of Science and Technology. The minister in the presidency was part of that committee. And the last ministry that was involved was the National Treasury, because there were definitely funding implications in how we mitigate AMD. And the culmination of that process then gave way to the Interministerial Committee endorsing 6 recommendations in order to mitigate the impacts of acid mine drainage for the Witwatersrand. The primary objectives at the bottom were water quality management and ingress control. And simply there, we had to ensure that the water qualities associated with acid mine drainage were managed so that it does not affect raw water resources. Ingress control simply refers to the fact that clean water needs to be kept on surface, because if it makes its way into a mine void, it becomes polluted. And if it becomes polluted, then it carries cost implications to treat. So if you keep clean water on surface, you actually reduce the amount of AMD that forms, and you are able to reduce your costs. In the medium term, AMD reuse was definitely flagged as a priority that needs to be considered, particularly in a water scarce country. And we were also tasked to improve monitoring and research and development around managing mine water. It was also recognized that acid mine drainage doesn't only come from underground mine voids, but that surface waste facilities are also contributors, and these need to be dealt with. And lastly, the longer term approach would be to ensure equity and meaningful financial tools can be put in place so that the core brunt of absorbing the AMD costs does not fall squarely on government, but that costs can be apportioned with the mining sector. Okay, so those are the 6 interventions that was endorsed by the Interministerial Committee in 2010. Now, that process, and specifically with regard to the water quality mitigation interventions, has given rise to the short-term solution. And the short-term solution has actually arisen through a directive that was given from the Minister of Water to its entity, the Trans-Caledonian Tunnel Authority, or the TCTA, in April 2012 to implement the short-term solution as an emergency work project for mitigating the WIT's AMD impacts. The project has been completed. It started from about 2012, and it was fully commissioned, I think, in 2016, May 2016. It's completed in all 3 of those basins, in the Western, Central, and Eastern basins. And we've expensed something like about 2.6 billion over the past 6 years to ensure that that project can be implemented. That's a total capital expenditure for civil works and related infrastructure. And it draws an annual operating cost of about 293 million for those 3 plants. That's the annual cost. Now, to summarize then, the basins are indicated. The locations are shown. It's Groote Vlei number 3 for Eastern, the Southwest Vertical Shaft in Germiston, and then in the Western Basin, shaft number 8 out in Krugersdorp. And the tributaries that are affected by each project, I've also shown that in the prior slides, the Blesbokspruit, which feeds into the Vaal, the Klip River, which feeds into the Vaal system as well. On the Western Basin, I indicated that the Vaal is not affected. It's the Crocodile West, which will make its way into the Limpopo Water Management Area. And average daily volumes, the Eastern is currently performing at around about 80 million liters per day. The plant has the potential to go up to 110 megs per day. The Central is pumping on average about 70 million liters per day with potential to be increased to 86. And the Western Basin on average typically performs about 30 to 33 million liters per day. I know the one area, or the 2 areas on the short-term solution that's been somewhat contentious is around the environmental authorization and the EIA. The reality is that this project was a government emergency water works, and through concurrence with the relevant departments, the project was implemented with an environmental authorization, but in the absence of an EIA because we were dealing with an emergency situation. And the timelines of about 18 months for an EIA to be concluded would not have allowed the project to be timelessly implemented to ensure, especially protection of the groundwater reserves on the Eastern Basin side. With regards to sludge disposal, for the Western Basin, I can advise that sludge is disposed into the Millside pit or the Westwits pit. So mine waste is deposited with tailings from a reclamation activity. In the Central Basin, the mine waste is deposited, the sludge is actually deposited at the Brakpan tailing storage facility. And in this regard, we actually have a working relationship with DRD Gold, where the sludge is pumped to the network of DRD and then taken through to the Brakpan mega dump, which sits just outside Carnival City on the East Rand. And for the Eastern Basin, in the project conceptual phase, the Groote Vlei dump was actually identified as the site where sludge will be stored. But on commissioning of the facility, it then came out that that dump was actually earmarked for reclamation, and so it could no longer be available. And as a result, then we drilled boreholes. Those boreholes are actually go anything from 600 to 900 meters deep into the Eastern Basin mine void, where the sludge is pumped for disposal. I know that with regards to the sludge disposal, there has been questions, and I'm suspecting that when we go into the Q&A session, I can look at the specifics and try to give responses there. But I hope that I've addressed the concerns with regards to sludge. Okay, this is just to give an indication, and here are the pictures that I'm reflecting are for the Central Basin. Starting at the top left, that is the site. Remember, it was an abandoned mine site. That's the site on the day we walked on and sort of took ownership of it. And then we show progression from groundworks through to civil works, through to the installation of the submersible pump. That pump sits, I think, about 150 or odd meters deep into the mine void, and it pumps water to surface where it can be treated. So these are just some of the pictures of how the project progressed from a bare naked site all the way through to R1 billion worth of infrastructure that we currently see on site today. The next picture shows you an aerial view of the Eastern Basin plant sitting just outside Springs. The plant out in the Central Basin is very similar to this. It's just about 30% smaller. So I'm not going to show too many pictures, but just to take you to the picture, I'm hoping that you can see my pointer, but that structure out there with the green roof is the pump station. And then we've got these 6 silos in the background, and that's where your lime, calcium hydroxide, and calcium carbonate alkaline material is stored to react with mine water to bring your pH up. Then we've got a series of mixers and reactors, and this is where alkaline material is added to cause your iron and metals to precipitate together with some of the sulfate. And then these 3 large pools up in the forefront of the picture are your clarifying systems. And that allows your clean supernatants to settle on the top and sludge to settle at the bottom of a conical structure. These are like cones, basically, these large clarifiers. And your sludge, being more dense, will settle out, and then it's pumped away for disposal underground. Or in the case of the Central Basin, it's pumped to the Black Pan tailing storage facility. In the background, you'll notice a wetland stroke riparian zone, and that's basically the blessed box plate system to where we discharge the clarified effluent into the blessed box plate. So this is what the plant looks like. It's operational, and we do receive requests for site visits, and I've said it in the past and I'll say it again. If there is any request for an interested and affected party to visit these plants, then you need to link up with the DWS, and we will gladly facilitate such site visits. One of the benefits derived with this plant is that as much as 300 tons of salt are recovered per day, and 300 tons of salt is basically 60 dump trucks of sulfate is prevented from going into the water resources. And anything from 48 to 180 tons of metal, which can be as much as 36 trucks, are prevented from entering the water resources. So there are certain benefits associated with the project, but with the benefits, before I get on to the disbenefit, I just want to show you the plant that's out in the Western Basin side. This is out just outside Randfontein or Krugersdorp. This is the Witwatersrand Basin. The plant itself is not a government infrastructure. It sits on the property, and much of the assets actually belongs to Sibanye Stillwater. The department's contribution in this regard is noted, and Sibanye performs the operations and maintenance as a contractor to TCTA. So this is also, it's not as glamorous as the plants out in the Central and Eastern Basins, but I can assure you when it comes to performance, this plant in some instances actually performs better than the conventional infrastructure that we've seen in the previous slides. So don't underestimate the performance of this plant. It's actually dealing with the worst quality AMD, but its performance is actually the best when you compare it relative to the other infrastructure. Okay, moving on, some of the benefits, aside from the recovery of polluted material, This is the same 18 winds shaft that I showed you that was decanting earlier on. And I think within 6 months of that project having been commissioned, this is one of the small successes we've seen where surface decant was completely arrested. And this has roughly been the order of the day now for about the past 8 odd years or so. Unfortunately, there's been about 2 or 3 episodes where we had abnormally high winter rainfall spells. And there were sporadic incidences of acid mine drainage coming in, but the impacts on the downstream environment was actually minimal. Moving on, I did indicate there is some challenges with this process, apart from operational limitations like power failures, plant or pump failures. We have sabotage of electricity lines, theft of infrastructure, etc. This has caused the plants to periodically go into modes of non-operation. But fortunately, through the TCTA's interventions, work is rapidly commissioned and the remedial work is put into place to bring the plants back online. The biggest challenge with this plant is that when it operates, the water that we see there has limited reuse because it does contain salinity typically in the order of about 2,500 milligrams per liter. And that water is really not fit for most uses. So this is a process that we need to address as part of the long-term solution. I'll talk a little bit more on that as we move forward. This slide was just to demonstrate to you how polluted the water is. This is taken in the reactor after alkaline material is added, and you can see the viscosity of the water as well as the color due to ion oxidation and some precipitation of sulfate. It's viscous, it's murky, but once it goes through the clarifier, there's a substantial improvement in the water before it's actually discharged to the environment. Just some of the progress and the observations. I did indicate that all of the plants, the short-term solution project is operational. We are noticing that the amount of AMD is actually increasing. We're not really seeing that despite even under a high pumping or high performance outputs, we really cannot see the reduction, any reduction in the amount of AMD that's being formed. The one issue that we have been cautioned on is prior to the commissioning of this infrastructure, the department was advised that your acid mine drainage will actually stratify in the mine void, resulting in a very poor quality water deep in the mine void and a better quality water higher up or as it comes closer to surface. The reality is that depth profile monitoring has not confirmed this to be the case, and we know that there is no stratification in the mine void, and neither have we seen any significant improvement in raw acid mine drainage, whereby we can actually accept arguments that we just allowed the mine void to flood and decant. If that was allowed, then we would be decanting very poor quality AMD, possibly into the streets of Joburg and into the local water resources. On the Western Basin side, and this is with reference to the facilities close to Sibanya, Stillwater, and the now abandoned Mintails mine, there was pit deposition where reclaimed mine tailings having a very high alkaline pH was deposited into various pits. And that activity actually saw an improvement in the overall signature of acid mine drainage in the Western Basin. Together with the short-term solution, pump and treat, we also became aware of the fact that the water that neutralized AMD was discharged to actually contributed to a restoration of the pollution impacts in the Zwartkrans groundwater compartment, which sits in the cradle of humankind. This is roughly about 5 kilometers north of the Western Basin mine void. There was a time when groundwater was not potable because raw acid mine drainage was decanting and making its way into the groundwater. And I think a time of 18 months or so, after the short-term solution was commissioned, that we were able to pick up that groundwater actually reverted to potable qualities, its background qualities. One of the risks that we were also cautioned of the fact that acid mine drainage will cause the cradle of humankind World Heritage caves, where the fossils are located, to become flooded. And this was a major concern amongst the archaeologists. but the monitoring, the static water level monitoring over the past 6 years or so has indicated to us that the risk of the cave being flooded is negligible. And I think the important point to point out is the fact that when we talk about an ECL, the ECL was a target that government was seeking to achieve in order to understand where it would need to maintain the mine water level. And the initial assessments was that we would have to maintain the water at about 160 meters below surface, measured at that shaft that I showed you where water was decanting about. As we speak, I think the water is currently about 4.5 meters below surface, and we are not seeing any impact on groundwater. So if you can imagine the cost associated with holding water at 4.5 meters below surface versus pumping it to 160 meters below surface, that's going to have a significant time and cost implication. And we've therefore modified our approach to redefine the ECL as not being 160 meters below surface, but rather preserving it anything from 5 to 15 meters below surface. Lastly, with regards to the AMD and the sludge disposal, or the treatment of acid mine drainage generated sludge, we can say for certainty that the disposal does present some challenges, and treating it to beneficial use has not to date identified any successes. So one of the limitations with this process is that you are going to get a sludge, and we need to identify very sustainable and permanent solutions to manage and dispose that sludge. Just a point on the fact that ingress, I talked about ingress, which refers to clean water making its way into the mine void, becoming acid mine drainage in nature. This is a initiative requiring attention, and DMRE, the Department of Minerals and Energy, is taking the lead on this. They have actually formulated an approach or a response with regards to projects that must be implemented. That come the new financial year, we will actually see DMRE starting to unpack some of these projects. Just a final point, I'm just struggling to read the, oh yes, I do recall there was also questions in terms of the residual salinity associated with the neutralized effluent discharges that's making its way into the Kip and Blessbox Great River systems and ultimately into the Vaal Barrage. The question asked was as to how much of clean water would be required to be released from the Vaal Dam in order to ensure fitness for downstream users. So in other words, to dilute the residual salinity associated with acid mine drainage. The latest data for the period October 2019 to October 2020 indicates that there were only 3 episodes, and these lasted no more than, it was 3 episodes of 48 hours each, that where dilution releases were required, and that was necessary to preserve the TDS in the Vaal Barrage catchment below 600, so the downstream users are not compromised. And I've done some maths, and to sum it up, if we discharge 150 megaliters per day of neutralized acid mine drainage into the Vaal Barrage, then it's estimated that about 60 million liters of clean water from the Vaal Dam must be released per day to mitigate that salinity signature. You would have to bear in mind that this dilution is not based purely on the acid mine drainage sulfate contribution. Other sources of salinity, your diffuse sources, point sources, the salinity associated with sewage and salinity associated with atmospheric fallout are also contributors. So the discharges from the Vaal Dam do not just mitigate the residual acid mine drainage impacts. It's also necessary to mitigate the other salinity impacts. If there's any further information on the Vaal Dam dilution releases, it can be made available after the meeting, or we can field that as part of the question and answer session. In terms of, just to show you a bit of trends with regards to the performance of these plants, on the Western Basin, I've just picked up a couple of slides to show you trends. We've seen a substantial reduction in iron. The blue dots indicate how the water is when it's pumped out of the mine void. I would say it looks like it ranges anything from 400 to about to to 30 or so milligrams per liters of iron. Historically, the iron has been in the order of about 800 milligrams per liter. Concentrations have actually improved, but it has somewhat leveled out now. So that's the raw water based on the blue dots, the blue sequence, and the red line right at the bottom on the x-axis actually represents the iron concentrations in our treated or neutralized discharge. So basically, the Western Basin, I did indicate it performs fairly optimally, and this is an indication of that performance in that it recovers virtually all iron out of the water prior to discharge. Moving to the next slide, also on the Western Basin, just to indicate to you sulfate. Remember, the system of treatment that we use is what we call high-density sludge. It's not dedicated specifically to sulfate reduction. It's meant more as a pH adjustment and for recovery of metals. So again, the series of blue dots shows you how the values are raw water, raw AMD, versus the red dots, which is the treated water discharge. And you can see by way of those green lines, the trends, that there is a marginal reduction in the amount of sulfates, typically coming from about 2,500 to about 2,200. So there's a partial reduction. And that is one of the limitations I did indicating that technology currently applied is not specifically meant to address sulfate, an objective of the long-term solution. Going on the Western Basin, a similar situation demonstrated for manganese, as is the case for iron. Again, this slide shows that in your treated effluents, virtually all of your manganese is removed to within specifications laid down in terms of the National Water Act requirements. And if I may move on to the Central Basin, again with the Central Basin, again, just to show you that in terms of your treated discharge as well, there's definitely some benefit where your sulfate is probably in the order of about 3,400 or so. And after treatment, we are able to bring it down to about 2,700 or so. So there's some relief with regards to sulfate concentrations. And lastly, for your Central Basin, again, we are also able to show that on the x-axis, the red line, it shows you that virtually all of your iron is recovered from the neutralized water prior to discharge. There was like I indicated, there was a question on the dilution releases, and this slide, the red line right at the top, shows you the TDS over the period September 2020 up until October 2020, and that's about the time when dilution releases are required. It's actually a seasonal requirement. It's important to note, looking at the right axis, that your TDS was never actually breached. TDS would be breached if we approach 600. But we found that as we approached the 600 mark, dilution releases were made just to prevent it going over the 600 threshold and keep the water within specification, so downstream users are not compromised. I did give the values, and I'm prepared to talk to it again in the discussion session. Okay. Now, the next part of this is how do we move from the short-term solution to the long-term solution? I indicated Jorgo's role in the feasibility study that was concluded in 2013. And that feasibility study actually conceptually outlined what is needed to be done or implemented moving forward to take the short-term solution works into a long-term solution where the water can be sustainably reused. The feasibility study is also premised on various high-level policy and strategic drivers, such as the National Water and Sanitation Master Plan, the National Water Resources Strategy 3, the Department's Mine Water Management Policy, and the Department of Minerals and Energy's Mine Closure Strategy, which is still to be gazetted for public comment. It's currently in-house work, and obviously in line with the SDG objectives for water resources conservation. The feasibility study also identified, and this was a cost in 2013, that the long-term solution is earmarked at about 10 billion rands, and it will incur an O&M cost in the order of about 900 million annually. Now, bear in mind, this is 2013 cost. 8 years later, that 10 billion is obviously would have increased And likewise, the O&M cost of 900 will also have increased. I'm not sure what the current costs are, but I'm referencing this because this is what the feasibility study talks about. Now, the one challenge that we faced is that there are fiscal limitations. The reality is that government is constrained with regards to development of all water resources projects. So we have to proceed in a phased approach in how we develop water resources infrastructure. With the fiscal limitations, it becomes obvious that curtailing costs with the long-term solution is necessary. And as a result of that, the LTS is provisionally deferred, but the LTS is not deferred because purely of fiscal limitations. It is also deferred on the basis that the more recent Vaal River modeling update indicated that the impacts or the dilution releases from the Vaal system are not as high as was originally predicted. So, now, I would say over the next 2 years is that the Vaal River system TDS model needs to be recalibrated using the more recent hydrological data. And that will then give a guidance in terms of when the long-term solution needs to be implemented and on what magnitude it will need to be implemented. In order to address the cost implications, we have to investigate alternative funding models, and I'm going to make reference to that in a later slide. And another concern that has been raised is as to whether an EIA will be implemented. I would like to assure the audience that engagement with TCT as implementing agent and work had originally started prior to the planned implementation of the long-term solution to commence with an EIA. That process was subsequently held back because the long-term solution, as I indicated now, has been deferred. In short, then what I'm saying is that if and when we implement the long-term solution, then it will be a definite case that a environmental impact assessment process will be unpacked, and clearly stakeholders and NGOs, example, will be part of that process. I have indicated to you that we have to also look at the broader impacts outside of the Witwatersrand goldfields, because the Witwatersrand goldfields has risen as a legacy issue. There's multiple factors that cause us to be where we are. And this is a lesson that must be learned as we move forward. We would want to recognize the areas where mining is currently actively being taken place. And in this regard, we are, the past few years, commenced on an assessment of these areas and formulating strategies to mitigate mine water impacts in these areas. And it's important because if we had to pick up large-scale macro impacts or predict these, then interventions need to be put into place whilst these mines are still active. Effectively, then, it's a case of the polluter pays mechanism becoming applicable to ensure that the mines being responsible for pollution act diligently to ensure that their activities do not have an impact on the water resources, especially a latent impact. In terms of Government Notice 704, which deals with water resources protection in the mining sector, that is due to be published soon for public comment. It has been updated to take into account certain technical considerations. The most important one there would be dovetailing it with the financial provisioning regulations. So that's an element that will also be considered in GN 704 going forward. And definitely as part of the gazetting process, stakeholders will be afforded an opportunity to comment. With regards to the NEMA financial provisioning regulations, which is a mechanism to ensure that latent or the post-mining impacts are mitigated, I am aware that the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries is planning, I would think, in the next 6 months or so to publish an updated Gazette notice in this regard, and there as well, stakeholders will have the opportunity to comment into that regulation. The waste discharge charge system is something that has been in the pipeline for a long time. There are technical and operational limitations as to why that cannot be implemented with ease, but it's receiving attention as we speak, and the process itself has actually been revived in the last 2 years or so. So we will be unpacking the waste discharge charge system, preferably through pilot projects in certain catchments before a broader rollout. And with the waste discharge charge system, there's also a concept from the National Treasury to implement an environmental levy on the mining sector to address the pollution impacts associated with mining. Over the past couple of years, the Department of Water and Sanitation, working with stakeholders and other government sector departments, has also formulated a mine water policy. And this policy then deals with mitigating mine water impacts across the entire mining value water resources chain. So that is all the way from prospecting all the way through to mine closure. It deals with a host of issues ranging from institutional to the technical issues on what is needed to ensure we don't have similar scenarios like what we've seen in the Witwatersrand goldfields. Department of Minerals and Energy is also drafting the National Mine Closure Strategy, and I also suspect in due course that there will be public engagements with regards to that strategy. The next bit of work relates to initiatives with the Strategic Water Partners Network, the Mine Water Coordinating Body, and the Impact Catalyst. These are basically partnerships between the private sector, and it involves some of the bigger mining companies working with government sector stakeholders to identify projects implemented that will have social, economic, and environmental benefits, particularly in a water resources context and in a post-mining context. Those details are projects that, or details of such projects, I think will be communicated on the websites of such organizations. And anybody interested is welcome to make a link with us so we can make reference to the relevant colleagues in these organizations for more information. Compliance monitoring and the reactive administrative enforcement processes, I think it's accepted that these areas of governance require improvement, and in that regard, there's definitely initiatives being led by the respective departments to train and improve the outputs of officials dealing with this kind of work. It's more than technical. It needs to link up now with the actual SAPS and the National Prosecuting Authority processes to ensure seamless flow of the entire enforcement chain to result in successful enforcement. It is only, I think, if you demonstrate a few successful enforcement cases that you will actually stimulate the sector to be more responsible with regard to dealing with environmental impacts. Another important element will be the consideration of in situ passive treatment systems, and these will work in low risk or low impact mines. There are some mines where the water resources impacts are fairly nominal, and through passive treatment systems such as artificial wetlands, you can actually make good progress in managing those impacts. Linked with this is also the issue of controlled mine flooding. And this is becoming especially pertinent in the Far West Rand goldfields, where controlled mine flooding is probably going to be the only mechanism to allow for sustainable mine closure. And I think if we really had to consider other options, then it's not going to be something that's very palatable to the mines. So this is a process that's currently receiving high-level attention. And I'm hoping that moving forward, it's something that can be effected and implemented within tight regulatory guidelines to at least test it and see how it can fit into other mining areas. Linked to the controlled mine flooding is also the issue of pit lakes, where certain low impact mines, especially our coal mines, can be allowed to recharge naturally through groundwater and surface runoff or rainfall, and then become a lake-like formation which actually mimics a natural lake with nominal impacts on the environment. The final point that I want to touch on in terms of a national focus, at least from a governance perspective, we do have what we call the Intergovernmental Task Team, and this ensures the core mandates of the various departments involved in natural resources and environmental regulation have oversight on the key mining issues that are facing the country. Okay, the next step, I think, is having learned the challenges dealing with legacy mining impacts. We have to build resilience into interventions as we go forward, and particularly if we have to work with the mining sector in trying to achieve sustainable mine closure and ensuring there's effective water management after mine closure. So definitely we have to look at the risks versus the opportunity. And the example that I'm going to cite in this regard is using the long-term solution to augment supply in the Witwatersrand. There's opportunity there for water to become, especially in a water scarce situation, for that water available for beneficial reuse. Finance and institutional models together with private sector partnership is definitely something that has to be considered. I believe that is only through financial contributions from the private sector and putting in place the relevant institutional models that we can see successful project implementation. The waste is always going to be the Achilles heels. The reality is that if you're going to treat mine water and deal with mine environmental impacts, there's going to be a waste threat that comes with that, and definitely sustainable solutions have to be implemented. And in that regard, we have to consider waste reuse, the regulations governing waste management, etc. There are some interventions identified to deal with mine waste, such as, for example, coal ashes that can be used beneficially. And fortunately, Environmental Affairs, as the custodian of the Waste Act, has in place a system that deals with beneficial waste reuse. Equity is another critical driver. Currently, as we speak, the issue of the costs of the WITS AMD project is absorbed between water users reliant on the Vaal River system and then allocations from the National Treasury. But we have to be broader than this and consider other fiscal tools like the waste discharge charge system, apportioning liability, the financial provisional regulation, which then forces the mining sector to contribute. And I think that if we talk equity, these fiscal or these revenue mechanisms are critical if we have to address the water reform objectives. And lastly, we cannot be looking at AMD as a waste, or for that matter, any mining impacted water as a waste. It has been demonstrated it can be successfully used to irrigate crops for human consumption. It can be used for potable purposes, and if it can be used for potable, then it can also be used for industrial and mining uses as grey water. So I think we currently in an environment where we tend to be spoilt in the reliance on turning on the tap to meet certain water uses. But definitely the reuse of mine water together with sewage is definitely going to be something that must be unpacked going forward to be sustainable. Linked to all of these issues in a post-mining context, and especially if we have to stimulate small-scale communities after mine closure, then definitely the availability of mine water will not be a threat or a risk. It becomes a resource. And I think it's important then that there are certain regulatory enabling factors that gives effect to the realization of these objectives. I think I've got just a couple more slides to bring us through to a conclusion. I talked about regulatory enabling factors, and what I'm showing here is what's left over after the Mintails plant out in the Westland in Krugersdorp was abandoned and then overtaken by illegal mining and Zamazama activity. You can see in the remnants of that facility, the grey roof structure is basically the pump station associated with the Western Basin plant. That is the only infrastructure that was preserved, and that was due to private security intervention through the TCTA and Sibanya to protect the asset. But basically, you can see that in the absence of a regulatory environment that sort of stimulates and give comfort to the mining sector, then we are faced with challenges where lawlessness is the order of the day, resulting in infrastructure being stripped away. And you have to also appreciate the fact that if you have an active mine, it is definitely contributing to formal economic stimulation, formal job creation. But if the regulatory environment makes this unconducive and mines have to abandon the facility, it then results in the environmental obligations lapsing into the state. So we must guard against similar scenarios occurring in the future. And I think it serves as a key warning in terms of what needs to be done by both private sector and government to ensure the scenario is mitigated. Okay, I talked also about regulatory enabling factors. This is a site situated out in Johannesburg where over a period of about 40 or 50 years, tailings has washed down from the upstream dumps and compromised the wetland. And this is a remediation process currently in process. And you can see tailings currently being excavated from a riparian zone for rehabilitation of that site. The picture to the top right-hand corner, you'll see the gentleman that's actually one of the team members, Divan van Niekerk. And he's a big guy. He's about close on 2 meters tall. And you can see that I put him there as a reference, but the amount of tails that's actually deposited into the riparian environment is then about 6 meters deep, stretching over several football fields. So that's the tonnage of waste that has been deposited. And clearly, I talked about the legislative and the policy tools that are in place or currently being developed. Those regulatory instruments need to give effect to support private sector involvement in the rehabilitation of such sites so that it can benefit the water resources and the broader environment, as well as have a benefit for the communities and societies that live around these areas. This is a slide that I can conclude on. Yes, it's the last slide. This is taken out in the Carltonville area, and that canal basically shows you very clean dolomitic water associated with dewatering of the far western goldfields. This is out in the western area, Carltonville area. And I like to use this slide because it just demonstrates this water in the canal is for all intents and purposes drinkable. It'll probably just need a bit of disinfection through ozone or chlorination and it becomes drinkable. But what I want to touch on is the fact that on mine closure, you're going to have a lot more water becoming available. It shouldn't simply be discharged in the canal, almost like it wants to be discarded. There's definitely communities that can benefit from the use of mine water. And it will be good to see private sector partnering with government to give effect to the realization of these objectives in line with government's national development plan. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it was a fairly long presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention. And I think I'll hand over to Mark now for a discussion on the arrangements and the way forward. But again, thank you for your time, and I appreciate you listening. I hope I've answered the issues that have been raised over the past couple of years, and we can probably then have an interesting discussion session after this. Mark, thank you very much. Over and out.